Welcome back to #Fempire. Today's guest is Liz LeClair, founder of Uprising Consulting. And this episode is one of courage, truth-telling, and confronting the status quo. What happens when you're told you're not a viable hire, not because of your qualifications, but because you dared to speak out against abuse of power and harassment in a sector that prides itself on doing good? Liz is an intersectional feminist with over 20 years of experience in the nonprofit and fundraising world. After experiencing workplace harassment and watching major institutions prioritize powerful donors over employee safety and the trauma she experienced, Liz chose not to stay silent. Instead, she built something new. Through Uprising Consulting, she speaks up about injustices in workplaces and is a volunteer with the Can't Buy My Silence movement. She works to shift power and funding to marginalized communities, applying a community-centric fundraising lens rooted in equity, justice, and activism. In this conversation, we explore the cost of speaking up, the weight and clarity that comes with naming harm, and how so-called nice sectors, like nonprofits, often hide behind a halo effect to avoid accountability. We cover a lot in this episode, from second-wave feminism to the weaponization and misuse of NDAs, and the power of the Me Too movement. Liz shares a raw, honest look at what it means to speak out and fight for change when institutions would rather maintain silence. Yes, there's fear in speaking out. There's pain in institutional betrayal. But there's also liberation and clarity in choosing integrity over quiet complicity. Quick heads up, this episode contains discussions of workplace harassment, bullying, and sexual harassment, including personal accounts. Listener discretion is advised. Please take care while listening. This isn't just a conversation, it's a call to action. So let's get into it. Today, I have Liz LeClair joining us from Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, and we're going to be having a really insightful conversation about the nonprofit sector, why there's a halo effect around it, and why we need to be cautious of that. And really, one of the most important pieces of our conversation today is going to be about the misuse of NDAs. So Liz, thank you so much for joining us for this very important conversation.
Thank you, and I appreciate you inviting me.
Really looking forward to it. So Liz, you're the founder of Uprising Philanthropic Consulting.
If you're mouthful, I just say Uprising Consulting. That'll probably make your life easier, yeah.
For those who might not be familiar, what exactly is this line of consulting and what drew you to this space in the first place?
I'm actually ended up out on the East Coast to go to Dalhousie University, did political science, really loved it. That was my jam. And that I was a real big dork, did the Model UN. If anyone's watched Parks and Recreation, I was full-blown Leslie Knope all the time. In so many parts of that show actually feel like my life. And I just had this vision that I was going to go off to the UN and do things and be like, save the world. And, pretty typical, like, fairly naive, I guess it would be the main thing. And I was actually at a Model UN conference when I met Maggie Carrington, who was a public relations officer with the World Food Program in New York. And she had been looking to hire an intern for the summer and met me, gave me her card, told me to apply. And I was lucky enough to get the internship. And I got there and I realized two things. One was that I am not cut out for actual politics. In theory, I love it. I love reading about it, watching it. I love the theory, and I'm a policy wonk, and I love all that kind of stuff. What I realized in real life was that I didn't love the politicking that was happening behind closed doors and what was required to do that. The other was that I wasn't very good at PR because I don't know how to finesse my own language, never mind anyone else's. When things were happening, I was like, I can't believe we're going to gloss this over or smooth it out or whatever. But I did find out that I loved the Walk to End Hunger, which was their main fundraising program. And that just got me addicted to this idea of like, I could do things working in community with people that I cared about and causes I cared about and see really tangible impacts. So came back to Toronto, Then I moved out west for about 7 years, worked with lots of different hospital foundations and other smaller grassroots organizations, and then I moved back out to the East Coast about 12 years ago now. And as for consulting, I mean, I would love to say that there's some particular reason for it, but part of this is that I've advocated myself. I've been such a public advocate and outspoken activist that I've pretty much done that to the point where most of the large organizations in this city, I'm not really a viable hire. So I could either see that as a disadvantage or an advantage, and I decided to start my own business. I fully believe that we need to shift, fundamentally revolutionize the way that the nonprofit sector works. And I try to do that through working with clients and communities that I really believe in and try to shift power through fundraising, but also helping communities that are generally underserved by giving them the tools to be able to resource the vision they have to solve the problems that they know that they're facing. It's not easy. I'm not gonna solve these problems in my lifetime, but I feel like I wanna be a part of change versus either walking away or just participating in the status quo for the sake of status quo. So I don't get it perfect all the time. I'm learning a lot. I'm also grateful to be in community with a lot of people who are doing the same. And I know you spoke with Esther Lee, who's also one of my favorite people, and Anika Allen, who we all kind of consider our mentor and friend. So yeah, that's the very long-winded how I got here.
And thank you for sharing. And just leaning into Parks and Rec, one of my favorite shows, as someone who's worked in government, I like to say working in government is a mixture of West Wing, Veep, and Parks and Rec all in one.
100%. Yeah, and I've not worked in government, but I'm on the periphery of it all the time and connected to lots of people who are, and it's probably an eerily accurate description.
You said a few points that also stuck out to me is that you're not necessarily a viable hire in your area. And I'm thinking of this as when I was really young, naive, if I would have heard that or personally experienced that, it would have just been so scary. I would have been like, oh my God, what does that mean for your livelihood and your future of your career? But now, as I've become more mature and I'm still learning and going through life, I understand that maybe not being a viable hire because you're an outspoken person, an advocate, that's a bit of a badge of honor because what you do is rooted in advocacy and speaking up. So, could you maybe share with the listeners why you're not a viable hire in Nova Scotia?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, it is a badge of honor. I think, I would just say before I get started in talking about that part, there's a lot of people that talk about fear. I know Esther talked about it and when she spoke with you. And yes, I think she's right. We've talked, was there fear in what I was doing? Absolutely. But I tell people a lot of the time, I think people think it's an isolating move, but I prefer to use the word clarifying. It really clarifies who is truly connected to you based on values, who's connected to you based on capitalist quid pro quo, who actually really wants partnerships. And the clients that hire me now are people that know who I am, truly know who I am and what I stand for. So I find that really liberating. When I moved back to Nova Scotia, I was in my early 30s, had just uprooted myself from being on the West Coast. I hadn't lived here in over a decade, and essentially sold everything I had, came here and started a job with the Children's Hospital Foundation. And I was young, in my early 30s. It doesn't sound like you're young, but you're still kind of really learning a lot of things. When I landed here, the first thing I was given was a file to work with one of the largest companies in the region. And I was asked to also facilitate a check presentation with an individual who was one of the co-owners of the company. And right from the get-go, inappropriate behavior, commentary, what I was wearing, commentary on how I looked. And I did what I had always done, which was really kind of sort of slough off or shake off the idea that this was just how older men behaved, which is in itself is we could spend hours digging into like the internalized misogyny and patriarchy behind that. But also, when I would raise it with people within the organization, I kept getting, well, this is just what he's like. there was this other event where something happened and he did this, and he's just like this. He's just known for this. So what it reinforced to me was, okay, well, this is somebody that the whole community is aware of. And I hadn't lived here in, again, a decade, and I certainly was not involved in any business. I was a student. So I can't really go into the full details because I'm actually in a civil suit with this individual. I filed a complaint. People can Google that if they want to. But the nuts and bolts of it came down to I went from that Children's Hospital Foundation to Dalhousie University and then to the QE2 Foundation. And all three organizations, so the three largest fundraising organizations in the city, all three of them, when I came forward in one way, shape, or form, whether I disclosed internally, reported it, or tried to advocate around, like, we need to figure out how to deal with this, all three of them eventually ended up taking gifts from this individual and his family. And it was a really clarifying moment. It was heartbreaking. I remember there was a day where I got a phone call from the CEO of the QE2 Foundation asking me if she could talk. And this was, like, literally 2 or 3 weeks after I had just had a radical hysterectomy to remove everything. I had endometriosis. I was going through treatment for things, and I thought she was calling to tell me about something because I had just left that foundation 6 months earlier, and she essentially called me and said, "I need to talk to you before 9 o'clock." And then on the phone, essentially disclosed to me that they were taking a $20 million gift from his family. And I remember sitting on the floor, I collapsed and I cried. And I cried for probably a half hour straight, and I just shut down because essentially what it was for me was not only had I done all the things I was told to do, all the things that society tells us to do, which is report, tell people, disclose, give them all the information, we'll be trauma informed, we're going to make sure. But not only had I done that, but I also had done that, bared my soul, and put faith in these organizations that they protect me. And when I did, essentially what happened was, and this is the experience of a lot of women I know in fundraising and pretty much any other line of work, is the organization didn't want to talk about it, kept using legalese saying that, we have to be careful about what you disclose because I can't be party to the, and then in the end really kind of protected themselves so that they could go and continue to have relationships with this individual. And so I decided there's two things I could do. I had already been quite public about my experience. I could either watch this and let them continue to own my story, and also for this individual to continue to go on in the community doing what he had always done, or I could file a civil suit so that people would know who it was and that they would know that this wasn't okay and I was drawing a line in the sand. Well, actually, the first thing I did was I actually wrote a public post. So nonetheless, all things said and done, we're still in court around a lot of this stuff. But what it really came down to was essentially I had said to most of the largest organizations in the city that I am not going to keep these secrets. It made me very unpopular. Um, at first, they all celebrated me back when I first came out with my op-ed in 2019, saying how brave I was and everything. But as soon as I wanted accountability and then I wanted to name him, things changed. And I find whether it's fundraising, nonprofit work, government, private sector, there are a small few people who hold power and privilege, and their money buys them a lot of latitude for bad behavior, or their position in proximity to power does. And I know this has been a long, drawn out explanation, but essentially why I'm unemployable in Halifax, we always joke around, is it's like a small town pretending to be a big city, right? There's only 1 degree of separation between you and pretty much anyone and everyone. You always have to be careful, look over your shoulder when you're saying something. Um, and yeah, I mean, every single of those three organizations I was connected to had board members from all the large companies, all the large charities. And frankly, I didn't want to go back to organizations where I could not speak the truth and where the truth wasn't celebrated. And, I still don't get everything right. But the one thing I can tell you is in the last 4 or 5 months since I've been on my own, probably the freest I've ever felt. I write what I want, I say what I want, and the only person I have to be accountable to is myself and live with my decisions, and I'm happy to be who I am, And if people don't like that, then they don't have to have anything to do with me.
Liz, I'm just really speechless. I just want to thank you so much for sharing that really traumatic time in your life. And it's really important that we speak up and have conversations about it because it's a reality in many workplaces. And I'm just terribly sorry that that happened to you. And when you're looking back at that time, you mentioned you were in your 30s and you've really been open about the choices you made and the context that shaped them. Can you talk a little bit more about what taking that step looked like and how support systems played a role in your decision to start your company, speak up about violence in workplaces and injustice for treatment of women who experience this in workplaces?
I'm 45. I'm in a different phase of my life. I'm also a white woman with a partner who's in the military. We've made some financial choices that have been very significant in order for this to be able to happen, but I have a lot of privilege, a lot of privilege. And this is not always the case for everybody. And you told me you were reading Collecting Courage. So, there's a lot of people out there that they have to participate in systems that harm them because economically there are no choices. And I'm fortunate that I did have a choice. And I don't know what the future holds, but I feel good about the decision I've made and where I am in my life right now. And I'm grateful for all the people that supported me through everything. And those that have stuck with me, I know they really are my friends. That's also gratifying to know, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say I'm so sorry you went through that. Well, Esther and I have talked about this. You brought it up, but the fear of speaking up is a very, very real, emotional, scary piece. And when you can overcome that, there's that liberation piece to it. And collecting courage, that conversation about a simulation and just going with the status quo. And when you said your piece about how this man, oh, everyone just brush it off. That's how he is. It's really is reminiscent of like boys will be boys and the locker club talk or whatever. And it's not acceptable anymore. And we're going to talk about this with the hashtag Me Too movement and Can't Buy My Silence. But yeah, I want to thank you for sharing that. And you said something that also really struck me there is people were rallying behind you and supportive of you when you first wrote your op-ed. And then when they found out who was involved, it was, "Oh, I don't wanna touch this with a 10-foot pole." Were you expecting that reaction, or what was that like to receive it as well from taking that stance to speak up and then receiving that reaction? Very polar opposite from how it started to when people found out who was involved.
Yeah. No, it wasn't. Truth be told. I think that was one of the great disappointments of this entire experience of my life. I think also too, the boys will be boys mentality was something that I was familiar with men. What I wasn't prepared for was how deeply that sentiment ran in female dominated workplaces. And all of the places I've talked about for the most part, except for one, everyone I disclosed to, with the exception of one person, were women. And they're what I refer to as second generation white feminists, like their idea of success is replicating the patriarchy and capitalism, which is if I get the position and I get the title that the men have had, then I've succeeded in being a feminist. And I think they are missing a lot. And I think they are equally as oppressive and harmful, if not more so. To me, it's like a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? You're walking around pretending you're like us. But when it comes to women experiencing harm in the workplace, in particular women of color and trans women and marginalized communities in the workplace, these women are not capable of fully embracing what feminism was intended to be, which was that this was about liberation of both sexes and that we were to be equals. And I don't want equality to equal that I have to tolerate bad behavior because you see your equality as being the top of an organization and the CEO. I want equality to be that this man, also who's trapped in a pattern of behavior because of whatever he's experienced in his lifetime, is able to escape it. I'm able to receive accountability and a true apology. The organization really apologizes. And I know it's one of the things that we talked about before as well was the idea of institutional betrayal. Institutions are built of people, but they behave like their own organisms, and their inherent first instinct is to protect themselves. Whatever you think of anything in nature, when it gets under attack or they feel they're under attack, they clamp down. And I yeah, I was really surprised. I was really shocked and surprised. And then the betrayals kept happening. I was so naive going into it. I didn't really understand the mechanisms of what an investigation looked like. I would be sitting for days or a couple of days or more than like hours at a time going through every excruciatingly embarrassing thing that ever happened, that I would feel like shit. And this is where the NDAs come in case people are wondering what the connection is. I sat down and I was asked to sit through an investigation with the Children's Hospital, or I guess I'm not supposed to say investigation, a review of what happened. And we went through emails and everything. And my husband came to be my support person. And the first thing they did is ask him and myself to sign NDAs. And my husband reluctantly signed it, but within the first half hour, the questions that we were being asked of me were making him so angry he had to leave. I never signed one. And I think they think that it was covered under my employment agreement, which I would just say to any of your listeners, every single person that signs an employment agreement under your intellectual property and confidentiality, you were supposed to protect the IP or whatever of your organization. A lot of these organizations are sliding donor conduct, customer conduct, employee conduct under the IP NDA. They try and say that you've signed something, you can't talk about this outside of work. In addition, when you file a complaint, whether it's racism, discrimination, bullying, whatever it is, assault in the workplace, if you come to terms with a settlement with the organization, they will demand an NDA. And what a non-disclosure agreement is, it was intended and built originally to protect intellectual property for people that were jumping from company to company, with probably the most prominent being in the 90s in the tech sector in Silicon Valley. But then they've become this blanket thing that lawyers are inserting into every process that demands some level of discretion. And they're predominantly at this point being used in cases of these harassment, abuse, assault, and discrimination in the workplace, so that when you either do an investigation or receive a settlement, that you can never talk about it again. And for me, it's violence. It's perpetuating violence, because one thing is that it's keeping the victim, the person that's disclosed, in a lifetime of silence around what's happened to them. And the other is that it's violent in the sense that the perpetrator often goes off to just do the same thing somewhere else. Unharmed and unwittingly another group of women or whoever are subjected to the same behavior. And to me, that's violence. You're aiding and abetting violence. And that's how I became involved with the Can't Buy My Silence campaign. That's why I've become such a vocal advocate. But also because I was lucky that I did not sign an NDA in that process, I was able to do what I've been able to do. And I really say that that's primarily hinged on the fact that the timing of my disclosure was around 2018, 2019, which is the height of the Me Too movement. Had I not been then, I don't know if I would have had the wherewithal to know what I was looking at.
And a few things I want to talk about, and you brought it up, this clinical element. Like, you even had to pause, use the word review instead of investigation, how really it no longer becomes about you and your experience when you report these instances. It becomes, how can we protect the institution? How can we protect everybody involved? You don't matter. Everything's an allegation. And I also want to point out, during these reviews or investigations, the experience from the victim is re-traumatization, because you're having to repeatedly tell these lawyers, these HR people, what happened to you, and reliving it and re-experiencing it over and over again by going through those emails, going through step by step what had happened to you in your experience, is just extremely exhausting. And again, I can't emphasize that enough. Re-traumatizing. Um, so power to you for powering through that. And again, just really grateful that you're taking the time to share your experience. And it's really important that we talk about
these things that happen in the workplace, because it is a reality in a lot of different sectors and we need to talk about it. We need to bring awareness to it, but we also have to act. And I think that collectivity of acting through speaking up is just so powerful. I went through something similar where I reported harassment and bullying in my workplace to my HR, made sure to get it all in writing. I think that's also a big thing that needs to be talked about more, unfortunately, when we talk about HR, is how do you not just navigate these systems and report them, but you need to know all these silly tricks because it will bite you in the butt if you didn't do it in the first place. And my HR rep, instead of dealing with the perpetrators, removing them and disciplining them, her recommendation, again, a woman, said, maybe you should you're burnt out. Maybe you should take a leave of absence and separate yourself from the situation. But what happens when I come back? Can you talk a little bit more about how these nice sectors, and I'm putting air quotes around nice sectors like nonprofits, avoid accountability under the guise of doing good work? And Esther and I talked about this in our episode, and I really liked the visual she put on it. She says that the nonprofit sector has this halo effect around it. You're doing good work, so because of that, you can't be doing harm. So, yeah, if you can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny, the nonprofit sector is either beloved or really reviled. If any of your listeners want to follow somebody that writes brilliant blog posts about this, is Vu Lei. Vu is one of the co-founders of the community-centric fundraising movement. And Vu, I love because he's just very like satirical, just really puts it out there in these ways that people can understand. But Vu often talks about like corporate splaining. People that are from corporations come in and it's like mansplaining basically. Well, I run a business, so I obviously can tell you how to run the nonprofit. It's kind of to me like indicative of how Elon Musk has come in and decided that he can get rid of government deficit and they're just running roughshod in there. And I talked about this on another podcast. I think people don't understand that we need a little bit of tension and friction, and government provides a certain level of friction because the decisions they're making are ones that really change lives, save lives, and end lives. Like, it can be very life or death. So yeah, on one end of the spectrum, you have people who are like, oh no, nonprofits are garbage, they're run badly. Elon Musk and Trump kind of have that attitude. We'll just get rid of them. And then there's the other side of it where we can do no wrong, which is also dangerous, right? We're a sector made of people, but the fundraising sector is highly feminized, 80% women. Uh, a good portion, 70% of those are, generally speaking, have primarily been white women. There's a lot of people that come to the work with martyrdom at the core of what they do. I'm a good person, therefore, how could I be doing bad things? I'd also encourage your listeners, if they want to check it out, there's some really great work done by a woman named Fleur Larson out in Seattle, who talks a lot about white women and their impact in nonprofits. But it's created this very waspy kind of like culture of niceness. And nice is not kind. Nice can be harmful. Nice can be, like we just talked about, propping up stereotypes. And I think the halo effect is that for a long time, these individuals have gotten away with doing what they've been doing because they're nonprofit charity workers. I think as we're seeing a demographic shift, and I just wrote a Substack post about Esther and all of the millennials and Gen Z, Gen Y who are coming up and just being like, I'm not okay with this. I don't think community-centric fundraising would have survived 20 years ago. And now I'm just like, that obviously this is where we're heading, because communities of color, communities of culture, Indigenous communities, Black communities are like, this is fucked up. Like, what are we doing? First of all, these individuals who are wealthy, majority of them, for the most part, have become wealthy either through their connection to already wealthy families in their community. They've had the privilege of, or they have a history, like a family history of wealth and privilege. Philanthropy itself, I mean, the modern version of it now, the one that we're talking about steeped in whiteness, is really originates from wealthy families who their second generation or the second son or second daughter couldn't take on the business, so they took on the philanthropic part of whatever. If you think of Succession, it's always like that second and third child that doesn't really know what their purpose is. And then you have just like a lot of white women whose husbands were, in work and they didn't know what to do with themselves. So they were in the PTA or they started something. I mean, I'm not trying to diminish that there is some value in volunteering and all that, but the way we do it and the ways we have been doing it have been harmful. So the halo effect is real. We also have to look at, there was a couple of statistical analyses done. The Foundation for Black Communities came out with a report in 2020 that said for every $100 donated or given in Canada to charities, less than 7 cents goes to Black-led organizations. The same came out, I think, with like Indigenous organizations, and I think it was something comparable or maybe less. So where we put our money is really showing us what you value, right? So nonprofit sectors tend to prop up and repeat the same patterns that capitalism does, which is that communities, predominantly white, well-off communities, have the largest foundations. They have the largest like the largest hospital foundations, the largest community foundations, you name it. And then you go to other communities where there's a history of discrimination and violence and discrimination against those communities, and you see that their nonprofits are mostly not registered as charities and they're not making anywhere near as much money. So yes, the halo effect is real. I think we've had a lot more leeway and bandwidth to cause harm than we should have. And I'm really happy to see there's a large community of people growing to realize that not only is what we do important, but why and how we do it important. How we do it is just as harmful sometimes as why we are. So anyways, I don't know if that explains that. Yeah, I just would really encourage people to read a little bit more. And reading Collecting Courage is an eye-opening experience. The racism that's embedded in our sector has been extraordinarily harmful. And again, I think part of my privilege of being able to do this work now as a consultant is that I can name these things in certain ways. And I've also had 20 years of working inside organizations. So I'm not speaking solely as someone who's always been on the outside of it, but I've been witness to it. And I also have perpetuated that harm myself. So yeah, we're all complicit in some way. It's what we choose to do once we know that we've been complicit. And I just wanted to say too, like, I'm really sorry about your experience, and I'm unfortunately not surprised. I have found HR to be one of the most harmful parts of most organizations. Unfortunately, they're not there to protect their employees. They're there to protect the organization. So that's unfortunately does not surprise me. Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually just about to say that. It's something we don't learn, or it's when you're on the job. It isn't until unfortunately something goes bad that you realize that reality and why HR is actually there. Yes, they're there to help you with your pay and vacation, all that stuff. But when it comes to when shit hits the fan, you're on your own. And it really comes down to having a support network around you. And it feels so hard when you're in the thick of it to realize, and there's thoughts of doubt and whatnot. But I want to go into that point as well about you made a really interesting piece about being complicit. And it's the institution you're in, unfortunately, right? It's become so normalized. And another thing that comes to mind, my mentor, Alison Venditti, she does a lot of great stuff for advocacy around moms at work. And she posted something and it really struck me. And I was like, thank you for saying this, because I used to think this all the time. But we don't need galas to talk about women and violence. Like, do the action in your day-to-day life, whether it is those microaggressions at work and stepping up to them, or talking to a younger woman in your workplace about what you're making, what you should be fighting for. And don't let that director who tells you you're too emotional and to tone it down. Both things that have been said to me. That's where we need to, I think, step up and show that good. That's a wrap on this episode. But don't go too far. Liz and I continue the conversation in part 2, where we continue to dive into the power of speaking up, what advocacy and feminism look like today, and how some governments are starting to crack down on the misuse of non-disclosure agreements. But there's still much more work to be done. I'm your host, Julia Pinella. Make sure to tune in for part 2 of my conversation with Liz LeClair, founder of Uprising Consulting. We'll catch you there.